Hello and welcome everybody. My name is Barbara Hernandez, the marketing manager from Atari. Thank you so much for joining today's event, Voice Security in Financial Services. Now for some introductions. This session will be led by Chuck French, the Chief Growth Officer from Atari. Hi, Chuck.
Hi, Barbara.
And Catherine Karwowski, Regional Manager from Atari. Good afternoon, Catherine.
Hello.
Please note that we will allow time for questions at the end of today's session. You can type your questions in the GoToWebinar box or click on the questions icon to pop out the type form to submit your questions. Now I will turn things over to Chuck to get today's session started.
Thank you, Barbara, and welcome everyone. We're so glad you could join us today. We've got an important topic to cover and frankly a lot to cover. And I'll stress this, what Barbara already mentioned. Catherine, I really do appreciate questions, so don't hesitate to use the tools in front of you to ask us to clarify, ask specific questions, and if appropriate, we'll address them in the webinar, and we'll follow up using the chat tool. We'll contact you after the webinar, so we'll do our best to answer all questions. So let's buckle up. Okay, so here's our agenda. We're going to talk about voice security terminology and principles. We're going to talk about the various areas impacted by voice threats, how to eliminate them, and how to strengthen security in your organization. But to get us started, I'm going to spend a little time on why this is such an important conversation, and specifically why this matters to you. And again, here are your presenters, Chuck French and Catherine Karwowski. As Barbara stated, I'm the Chief Growth Officer, and Catherine's one of the leaders on our Atari sales team. She interacts with our existing and prospective customers daily, and she's unofficially our field expert in financial services. She's going to bring some concrete examples regarding voice threats. And for those of you not familiar with Atari, I'm going to give you the brief commercial on it. As an organization, we've been around for around 30 years, actually longer than 30 years now, and we are the authority in voice security. That's our tagline, and I'm really proud that we earned it. No one's doing more to be the leader in protecting voice. It's our company's mission. I think it's important to point out Atari is also an ESOP company. All of us, everyone at Atari are owners, and it makes us the most aligned company you've ever experienced. So thanks again for joining us. All right, let's get into it. I'll start with the one big takeaway of this entire presentation, and that is voice threats are real. If you remember that one thing, that's it. Voice threats are real. And don't take my word for it. In April of this year, the FBI published a public service announcement stating that cyber criminals target victims using social engineering techniques. These techniques include impersonating employees, SIM swapping, call forwarding, and simultaneous ring, and traditional phishing campaigns, which are scam emails. And most of the attacks have a voice component. The FBI doesn't make these announcements very often, so when they do, it's kind of a big deal. And in this one, they acknowledge the severity of voice threats on financial institutions and any other organization that's protecting data. So remember, voice threats are real. Then a few months later, the FBI expanded on their public service announcement with a joint cybersecurity advisory that they published in conjunction with an organization called H3C, which is the Health Sector Cybersecurity Coordination Center. In it, they got much more granular. And to fully appreciate it, it's really important that everybody understands that initial access is the first step to a cyber event, such as a ransomware attack. The bad actors need to get in, and that's the initial access. So when we look at this joint cybersecurity advisory, the threat actor called an IT help desk, posing as an employee of the organization, and triggered a password reset for the targeted employee's organizational account. So I'll reword that a little bit to make sure everybody understands it. The bad actor, the bad person, used a phone and called IT and was able to get a password reset. And once that happened, they didn't have to hack into the organization any longer. They were in, they could just log in. Really, really important. So next, look at the numbers that they're highlighted next to the quote, which is T1566.004. So that's an ID number for the type of attack in something called the MITRE ATT&CK framework. That's probably a new term for some people on the phone today. The MITRE ATT&CK framework is really a knowledge base that helps cybersecurity professionals model and detect, prevent, and fight cyber threats. So the FBI in this case said that the initial access that took place was via phishing, via using voice. They call it spear phishing voice. And in Mutari, this is called voice phishing, or simply phishing for short. That's that social engineering tactic to manipulate a user into providing information via the telephone. These bad people used the telephone to get credentials, and you'll see in a moment, financial service organizations and insurance companies and brokerage firms, investment firms, even the finance area in any organization is a lucrative target. And so why would that be? Well, these entities, these departments, they need to answer the telephone, and the telephone's not protected. And the FBI just told you how it was done. So you're a bank, you're a credit union, you're an investment firm, brokerage, insurance company, whatever. This is why this really matters to you. Financial institutions are 300 times more likely than other businesses to experience a cyber attack. 69% of financial organizations, they personally feel unprepared to meet the challenge of fraud and phishing and social engineering tactics and attacks. And 75% of financial service organizations reported a data breach over the past 5 years. And that's compared to about 2/3 of other organizations overall. So obviously at a higher rate. And 55% of financial organizations report that the cost of recovery from a data breach is somewhere between $5 and $10 million. So you'd think Willie Sutton's famous quote would be why bad actors target financial institutions, right? It's where the money is. But it's more nuanced than that. A financial institution has much more than money. It's also where a treasure trove of personally identifiable information is located. And I think that everybody knows what PII is, right? In fact, I should have created a poll for this one. It would be, how many credit protection services have you been provided in the last year? My personal answer would be 3. And why am I being offered all these credit protection services? Companies keep losing my personal identifiable information. PII is a currency, and when bad actors get it, you and your organizations are more at risk. We all need to be more vigilant about protecting our personal data and that of our respective organizations. And the number of attacks, they're not going down. In fact, there are plenty of trends that will ensure that voice threats remain a problem for all of us, and it's unfortunate. Here are a few. Voice is becoming a preferred path for initial access, and it's simple because it's unprotected, particularly if your organization's like most in the financial services space. You have to pick up the phone. The bad actors have direct access to you and your data. Gen AI, that's real, and making these threats even more effective, and more to come on that point. And unfortunately, your organization might not be equipped to address the problem of voice security simply because the owner of the issue isn't established. Is it IT or collab? Is it cyber or risk? Or is it your contact center? Who's to say? Ownership of voice security is a problem. The fact that your trusted advisors may be siloed just complicates the issue. Go ask Gardner about the issue. Have them introduce you to their analyst that covers voice security. And I'll give you a hint right now, that person doesn't exist. The higher quality resellers are starting to figure it out. A holistic and collaborative approach is definitely needed. Next, awareness of preventative technologies versus training is needed. Keep doing the training. Everybody needs to do the training, but let's keep our eyes wide open about it. A highly skilled adversary armed with the latest Gen AI tech is going to defeat your humans. No contest, but there are tools available to help defend against such threats. And the last point, it's not on the screen here, but I need to make sure shared, is that We for a long time, we at Mitari did too. We thought that the telephone carriers would solve the problem. We all have to accept that the carriers can't and aren't going to solve the problem of these unwanted calls. The incentives aren't there. Even if they could block dangerous calls, they don't want the legal liability. So they stay in safe harbor to avoid litigation, and those nefarious calls continue. All right, so we're gonna transition a bit into a little bit about how all this stuff works. And we're gonna start with the attack surface. So the image on the right side of the slide, that represents the different types of attack vectors that need to be protected in enterprise security and risk management program. We'll need more time than we have available to go through all the different elements of the attack surface, but I think everybody here, regardless of what your role is, should know the usual suspects. It's email, it's your bank servers, it's things like that. And for most organizations, there's a massive gap related to voice threats, and the bad guys know it. So by definition, though, an attack surface is the sum of all the potential points where an unauthorized person or attacker could try to enter data into or extract data from or otherwise compromise the system. Think of it as the total area exposed to potential cyber attacks. Some key points about it, though. The larger the attack surface, the greater the risk of a successful attack. So the more complex you are, the more exposure you have. They're dynamic and they're constantly evolving. So you got new technologies, you've got software updates, you've got changes in user behavior. All that stuff impacts the attack surface. And last, there's technical and there's human elements. The technical vulnerabilities might be outdated software or misconfigured firewalls, while the human elements involve being apt to being socially engineered through a phishing scam or social engineering or something like that. For the most part, though, the security professionals understand the data elements of the attack surface. The human element remains the conundrum. And of course, the piece that's most important. 95% of all cyber events involve a human. The gap's clear in the attack surface, and it's clearly the voice. And there's a bunch of different attack types. This is a little bit more tactical about this, but let's make sure we go through them so we have some definitions here. Robocalls. Unfortunately, we all know them. They can be good and they can be bad. There's nothing that needs to be described there. A spoof call, that's a caller ID that's been altered in some way to mask the source of the call. We've all experienced those as well, right? Where you get a call and it's clearly not the person they purport it to be. Voice spam, that's a blanket term. That refers to any sort of unsolicited or unwanted phone call, whether it's a nuisance call or one of criminal intent. And then, of course, we've already covered phishing, which is voice phishing. And that's that socially engineered attack where humans are manipulated for information. That was the topic of that FBI Joint Cyber Advisory. It's definitely effective. According to the 2024 State of Phishing Report from Social Engineer, more than 25% of phishing attempts on employees over the past year resulted in them being compromised, meaning they gave up information they shouldn't have provided. And what's more, and this comes from the same report, such attacks are on the rise with a reported 260% increase from the fourth quarter of 2023. No good. Next, we've got voice spam storms. That's that sudden influx of those auto-generated scam robocalls targeting a specific population to stop communication. And we've covered social engineering, which is a general category. I think everybody should get the gist of that by now. But of course, there are Gen AI attacks that can be a component of all these other tactics. Gen AI is important, and we'll dedicate a slide to that right now. Okay, so Gen AI, definitely an escalated threat, but before we even delve into it, I want to thank the Mitari marketing team for this slide. It was created actually using AI, and I'm not going to flip it back and forth too much because I don't want anybody to get ill, but I think it is a really good visual, and I hope anyways, I enjoy it. So generative AI, let's just get into it. All right, it's rapidly evolving, and it's becoming now more of a primary tool. with just a few seconds of your voice, let's say from an outgoing voicemail message, the bad actors can replicate your voice using tools that are readily available on the dark web. And they're so convincing that they can even fool your closest family members, which actually happened recently to someone in the Mutari family, where one of our team members had their voice replicated by their teenage son. It's easy to do, and they used it with off-the-shelf tech. So imagine that implications of voice of this type of technology for a voice authentication system. Systems that rely on voice biometrics, they can now be easily bypassed by using AI-generated voices. These advanced tools, they really are empowering scammers to conduct highly targeted, socially engineered attacks. They can impersonate a trusted person. They can impersonate family members, bank officials, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. But according to a recent report from CFO Magazine, 85% of cybersecurity leaders believe that recent cyber attacks have already been augmented by this type of technology. That's alarming, especially because as humans, we're all fallible. That's really our nature. The more realistic the threats become, particularly as it relates to manipulating voices or video via AI, the harder it's going to be to protect ourselves. So there's a lot of hype around Gen AI in general, but I don't think we've done enough really discussing it as a cybersecurity threat. Mutari takes it very, very seriously. Which gets us to our next subject here, which is a few scenarios. And I've created 3 that we'll cover. The first one is CEO or C-suite fraud. In this type of an attack, the threat actor convincingly impersonates your CEO's voice, calls a senior finance executive. The impersonator urgently requests a large wire transfer to a new vendor, and they even fabricate a time-sensitive need, which is all part of the scam. The executive, deceived by the familiar voice, pressured by the urgency, they bypass all the verification protocols and authorize the transfer. Your institution suffers significant financial loss due to the fraudulent wire transfer, and it impacts not only your bottom line, but it damages reputation and erodes trust among clients and investors. This kind of stuff happens all of the time, and it'll happen again. When we think about vendors and impersonation, it's somewhat similar, right? The attacker comes in, they mimic the voice of one of your regular vendors where you have a relationship. They get in there, they talk to, contact accounts payable. Hey, they talk, hey, we're changing bank account details due to an acquisition or some other event. The attacker provides the new account information, and next thing you know, you've unknowingly processed payments to the attacker's account, leading to significant financial losses. Attack disrupts operations, strains relationships with the legitimate vendors, and you have to put in additional security measures. Whether you're a financial institution or not, maybe it's just the finance department, this stuff happens again all the time. The next one related to IVR, IVR schemes, is one that frankly we don't talk about enough, and people don't really keep it top of mind. And in these types of attacks, the threat actors, the bad guys, are really exploiting your IVR system. They're using stolen or socially engineered customer information that bypass what the knowledge-based authentication or KBI questions. And by successfully navigating the IVR, they can validate a large volume of stolen credentials. And what does that mean for you? Well, those validated credentials are bundled up and sold on the dark web. It allows further account takeovers and fraudulent activity across your platform and others. They compromise customer data, facilitates financial fraud, damages your reputation and your reputation for safeguarding customer information. Or frankly, if they choose, the bad guys can actually execute an attack by accessing the customer's accounts, staging account credentials, or getting sensitive information. There are a few lessons here, and that applies to any voice call coming into your financial institution's contact center. Sometimes getting into the IVR is the target. You don't think about that enough. And knowledge-based authentication isn't adequate protection. Catherine's going to speak to an ecosystem approach to voice security in a bit, but I'll share one story. Just last week, one of our strategic partners, Pindrop, held a webinar on fraud. Their guest presenter was a lead for an enterprise fraud policy and governance group at a large regional bank. And per the statistics that he shared, fraudsters passed knowledge-based authentication 60% of the time. In reality, he said the fraudsters were passing KBAs at a higher rate than customers. The fraudster could have a spreadsheet in front of them or have all the information in front of them, while the customer had to really think about the answers for a knowledge-based authentication. So think about that. Can you remember the name of your favorite movie at the time you inputted your original answer? I don't know if I could in all cases. Maybe your favorite movie changed. They can get it right away, potentially before you can. So I found it amazing. I found it terrifying. Hence, we need to keep thinking about keeping bad actors away from the IVR in the first place. So there are other threats, but here are a few of them that are derived by phone calls. As I said at the top of this presentation, voice threats are real. So we're going to pause here for just a moment. We're going to see if we have any questions. Barbara, are you seeing anything out there?
No questions at this time, Chuck. Thank you.
All right. Well, we're gonna transition to my colleague Catherine here, who's gonna bring us into the next section about really understanding the impact of these bad voice calls on financial services.
Thanks, Chuck. And hello, everyone. I am delighted to be your co-host in today's discussion. And so on the heels of Chuck's comments, I just want to say, I don't think there's any question about the value of the data you're hosting, and protecting that data as best you can is something we all agree is paramount. So there is a pervasive use case to strengthen security controls for every vulnerability in the organization, and voice is certainly no exception. But this is nuanced, and as Chuck pointed out, the tactics can be pretty complex, especially in financial services. So I think putting a little more focus on the key impact zones is going to help put some framework around this. Now, when we drill down and isolate the voice channel as this initial access point, Chuck's already outlined all the bad ways and the tactics that the bad actors are using to get in via voice, with, of course, Gen AI being the latest and greatest tactic, not to mention the most frightening. But just a quick reintroduction of me. I'm one of the folks here at Mutari whose responsibility it is to onboard new clients. So I get to be really in the trenches with our customers and hear all about the different types of voice attacks that they're experiencing. And in some cases, how they've attempted to combat the problem. And more often than not, the strategy I hear is that when it's an unknown caller, they just simply don't pick up the phone, which is fine if you're an executive in a vertical that doesn't rely on inbound voice calls for day-to-day commerce. But this approach simply is just not an option for most of the folks in financial services. So back to the framework I mentioned. It's interesting to me because all of the pain points that I consistently hear about in finance tend to fall into these three main areas. You've got customer support, your agents, and protecting them from being victimized by all the social engineering tactics that Chuck just described, but also cleaning up all the garbage calls and preserving your agent's ability to be efficient when they're addressing customer needs, which leads directly into customer experience and your clients. So all things related to customer experience are getting impacted by spam calls. So think about hold times and handle times in a contact center, really impacting a customer experience when they dial in. And last, of course, we've got risk management and security, and the security risk that's tied to allowing these threat agents to ring right through. So let's flesh this out with just a little more detail, and I'll give you a couple of examples. Customer support and customer experience, these go hand in hand, and you really can't have one without the other. So as I stated earlier, we all agree on the fact that security is paramount. I will say every financial services organization that I've onboarded in the last 18 months has reported some incidents of phishing or voice phishing, which again is social engineering via the voice channel. One of my more recent clients tied it back very specifically to customer experience. Now, that particular organization has a very high touch culture with their clients. So the interactive nature of the telephone delivers this the most efficiently. And as a large brokerage firm, it's one of their key differentiators. It's, you know, in what is a highly competitive space. So it's a high priority for them to deliver a human-to-human personal touch with every client interaction. And what they were finding was that ghost calls consistently ringing into their agent phones were dramatically impacting their agent's ability to be responsive. So the downstream impact of this was increasing hold times. So after implementing Mutari, we started filtering off over 1,300 calls a day, which when we put this in terms of agent handle time, quantifies to 8 full-time employees. So just a good example of both customer support and customer experience getting a boost. So let's talk about security for a minute. This goes without saying, but I'll say it anyway. Security is a high priority for everyone in financial services. And for this, many of you have likely implemented caller authentication tools. Chuck just mentioned PinDrop. Maybe you've even taken it as far as a biometric authentication solution. We here at Mutari applaud this, we support this, and we get asked a lot about how we fit into that model. And it's actually a really great use case for what we're doing. One of our customers came to us because they had actually already implemented a biometric authentication tool in their contact center. And it's a usage-based pricing model where they have to pay for every caller authentication that comes through. So naturally, a lot of garbage calls were being presented to the authentication tool. And they were looking for a way just to better optimize that usage. So they implemented us, Mutari, and we sit way out in front of the call flow. And I'll show you what that looks like in a minute. So we're able to knock down those malicious callers before they ever get to the authentication tool. In this particular case, it was over 700 calls per day that we filtered out before they made their way into the contact center. Not only was this a really huge cost savings, but it tremendously optimized the utilization of the authentication tool because all the garbage calls were filtered off. So just a really great example of how we really are better together with any authentication practices taking place in the contact center. So now that I've covered the key impact zones, customer support, customer experience, and security, I just want to spend a minute discussing just some of the different stakeholders for each one of these key areas because they are all very distinctly different. So the folks that care about this fall into 3 distinct areas. You've got IT, you've got security, and you've got your contact center. And we've actually developed a summary of best practices around voice security. 16 recommendations are summarized in which of these 3 stakeholder groups care about this. So right now is a good time to pull out your phones and grab a picture of the QR code so you can get a copy of this report. And while you're doing that, I'm going to tell you one more client story just to help underscore this. So this is actually a large credit union, and the engagement started out with the voice IT team. And there was strong acknowledgement amongst them that spam calls were an issue. They were being flooded with trouble tickets. They were severely straining their voice engineering resources to go block calls at the SBC level, only to have bad actors change the phone numbers they were using and call in and using a different number. So they were gravely concerned about the security implications, especially after hearing about some of the successful phishing attacks like MGM or Robinhood, where threat actors posed as an employee and very easily socially engineered help desk agents to turn over access credentials through a password update. The IT team didn't have budget for the solution, but they knew if there was a security breach from a voice call, that problem was going to land smack dab right on their desk. So we worked together to identify some of the additional departments that have a stake in this: cybersecurity and contact center. So they pulled together a call with both the contact center director and the security team to weigh in on the solution. And the contact center director was over the moon. Once she began to understand how this was going to augment her agent productivity and subsequently her customer experience. The security officer evaluating it, well, once he understood that the application can actually inform his existing security tools like a SIM or an XDR, he was all in. Because here's the thing, he recognized the need for security provisioning for voice, but needed to be able to monitor it in a single pane of glass via his existing tools, his existing infrastructure. And we support this. Security teams are able to monitor any voice threats and correlate this to any cyber events taking place elsewhere in the organization. So this is tremendously powerful. And in that case, the decision to move forward was made swiftly. The project got funded, having all three of these departments weighing in on the solution made for a foregone conclusion, and we kicked off the project a few weeks later. So our intention today really was just to spend some time discussing the voice security problem and then tie it back to your specific operations. But as a sales professional, I can't resist the opportunity just to give you a glimpse of the solution and some of the methodology that we used when we developed it. And by all means, if you have an appetite for anything more, please let us know. We're happy to do a comprehensive overview, including a lot of the technology that's behind some of this stuff. But right here, what you're looking at, this is really just meant to be a visual of where we sit in the call flow. And as you can see here, Mutari sits way out in front, well ahead of any CRM lookup, ahead of any IVR and any ability to engage in some of those IVR schemes that Chuck referenced. And of course, in front of any caller authentication tools and agent activity. And again, the reason you care about this is we're going to knock down these calls. We're going to divert them before they ever make their way into any of these tools, and most importantly, any of your people. So I'm going to just go one step further here and talk about the actual filtering that we do. And the best way to think about us is a firewall for your voice traffic. And we're taking a layered approach by running all of your inbound calls against these 5 filters. Now, number one most frequently asked question is there latency with the call, or will the caller know that this screening is taking place? Are they going to hear any pause? And the answer is no. We're doing this query in a fraction of a second, so it's completely undiscernible to the caller. They have no idea they're being screened. So the first layer we've got here, stir shaken. It's important to know we're not a stir shaken replacement. We're simply just giving you tools to take action on a call based on any stir shaken data coming from the carrier. The next thing here is our proprietary database, which is actually an aggregate of a whole bunch of lists. And I could go on and on about the merits of our database because this really is the workhorse of the application. But suffice it to say, we've assembled the largest repository of unwanted phone numbers, and it's constantly updating. So we're going to query the database. Next is Threat Radar, which looks at the traffic on your systems. And we're looking for any unusual calling behaviors. So this is where we pick up any TDOS type behavior or any dialer behavior. We also look for phone number spoofing here. Next is custom rules, which is really the most straightforward layer. This is where you can add rules to block or allow calls based on certain criteria like caller ID or CNAM. And then the last layer here is our voice CAPTCHA. And this is just one of the routing options that you have for any of the calls flagged by the first 4 layers. So before I explain how the CAPTCHA works, I want to call out one of the coolest features about this application. And this is the routing capabilities. So you have tremendous call control over how any spam calls are handled. Many of our clients have concern about false flags and inadvertently dropping a legit caller. So this is really where the power of the tool comes into play. So you can route these questionable calls anywhere. You don't have to drop them. You can route them to a skill group or a team that's maybe better equipped to handle social engineering, or you can route them to the CAPTCHA. Now the CAPTCHA is automated, and it does an additional verification on any of these flagged calls. And the way it works is the caller is just going to hear a custom greeting. Thank you for calling XYZ organization. For added security, please dial the following digits. At which time a 3-digit code is announced, and that code is randomized. So it's going to knock down any bots and allow human beings to pass. So again, this really is just a 50,000-foot view, like I said, but we're happy to spend some time to go deeper and speak more specifically about call flow, deployment options, all the things that you're going to be interested in understanding. And the last thing I'm going to talk about is probably my favorite. We have some really good options to help you quantify the problem. And the reason this matters is because it's really powerful to be able to see how many nefarious calls you're currently getting per day and how many full-time employees this equates to simply by removing the handle time tied to the unwanted calls. So the first option we've got here is our voice traffic analysis. And this is not a heavy lift at all. You simply have to export CDR records. So we're going to take that CDR report of just your inbound calls, like 30 to 90 days of inbound call records. We'll run a query, and we do this offline. We do an offline query against just our database and are going to quantify the volume of calls that we identify as spam. So that's one option and the easiest, path of least resistance. The second thing here is our fully installed proof of concept, which is a little more comprehensive, but this gives you the opportunity to leverage all 5 technical controls and experience the interface and all the call detail this provides. So both great ways to get some insight into the spam calling volume. And that's it.
Boy, oh boy, isn't it amazing how fast that happens? We're about 37 minutes into this. We stated we were going to do this. We were allocated 45 minutes. Barbara, do we have any questions from the audience?
We actually do have one question, Catherine, around the CAPTCHA tool. It states, I'm worried about compromising the customer experience for all of the calls that get presented to CAPTCHA. How is this handled by other organizations?
Oh, great. That's an awesome question. And let me first address what is a very common misconception about the use of the CAPTCHA. So to be clear, the only calls that get presented to CAPTCHA are the suspect calls. So these are the calls that were flagged by one of those first 4 layers. And by the way, of those, we routinely see about 95 to 90% of those calls fail the CAPTCHA challenge, meaning they were bots. So it's important to know the callers that do hear the CAPTCHA will hear a custom greeting that's specific to your company. And we've actually even had clients use their marketing team to record the CAPTCHA greeting. And so they're using like a branded voice. So something that a voice that their clients are accustomed to hearing. So that's how we address that.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Catherine. At this time, oh wait, we do have one additional question that came in. Can this be used for both on-prem and cloud calling, either Chuck or Catherine?
Well, the answer to that is yes, but what I would prefer is, I don't know who this is that asked the question, is they engage with us offline so we can get some more specifics around it. But the short answer is yes.
Excellent. Thanks, Chuck. And we will send a follow-up email at the end after today's webinar, and you can respond directly to that email. And we will ensure that somebody gets back to you with any other questions. At this time, I don't see anything else coming through, so I guess we'll end today's session. We would like to ask if you could just take a minute to give us some feedback. There will be an automatic survey that pops up when we end today's session. And just appreciate everybody's time today. Thank you so much, and hope you all have a wonderful day.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.